Before we begin, ask yourself one simple question. If you spent 20 years earning the love of an entire nation, smiling when your heart was breaking, standing straight when your legs were shaking, saying nothing when 1,000 people whispered your name behind silk fans, how long would you keep quiet? A month? A year? And what would it take, finally, for you to stand up in a room full of crowns and cameras, put down your fork, and walk out the door in front of the whole kingdom? Tonight you are going to meet a woman who did exactly that. Her name was Elowen, and the moment she pushed back her chair, a kingdom that thought it knew everything about her learned that it knew nothing at all. The palace of Windhaven sat on a green hill above the old river town of Marin's Cross, and for 300 years its tall windows had glowed gold on the night of the winter table. The winter table was the oldest dinner in the kingdom. Every important family came. Every camera in the land pointed at its doors. And every year, the people of Windhaven stood in the cold streets below just to watch the great cars roll through the gates, hopping for one glimpse of the woman they loved most in the world. That woman was Princess Elowen. She had not been born a princess. She was born in a small stone house near the coast, the daughter of a schoolteacher and a woman who sold flowers at the Sunday market. When she was young, nobody in the palace knew her name, but she had a way of looking at people, really looking, as if each person she met was the only person in the room. And when the young Crown Prince Aldrich met her at a charity race 20 years ago, he later said he forgot his own name for a full minute. They married in the spring. The whole country cried happy tears, and from that day, Elowen belonged to the people as much as she belonged to the palace. But belonging to a palace is not the same as being wanted by one. There was one person inside those golden walls who had never warmed to Elowen. That person was Queen Marlize, the second wife of King Rowan, Aldrich's father. King Rowan's first wife, Aldrich's mother, had died when Aldrich was still a boy, and the whole kingdom had grieved her like a saint. Years later the king married Marlize, a sharp and clever woman from an old noble family called the Vashicourts, and the kingdom never quite forgave him for it. In their eyes, Marlize had taken the place of a beloved queen. In Marlize's eyes, Elowen was the living reminder of everything the people would not give her, their love. For years the two women had circled each other with perfect, freezing politeness. They smiled in photographs. They stood side by side at ribbon cuttings. They passed each other in long marble corridors and said good evening in voices as smooth as glass. But everyone who worked in the palace, every maid, every guard, every cook knew the truth. Between the princess and the queen there was a war. It was a quiet war, a war made of small cuts and cold looks and seating charts, but it was a war all the same. And this year, on the night of the winter table, that quiet war was about to become very, very loud. It began 3 days before the dinner. Elowen was in the East Wing, helping arrange the flowers herself. She always did, no matter how many staff offered to take over, when one of the younger footmen knocked and stepped in with an envelope. His face was pale. He handed it to her the way a person hands over a thing they wish they had never touched. "For you, ma'am," he said, "from the Queen's office." Elowen opened it. Inside was the final seating plan for the winter table. She read it once. Then she read it again, slowly, because the first time her mind had refused to believe it. For 20 years at every winter table, Elowen had sat at the king's right hand. It was not a small thing. In Windhaven, where you sat, told everyone who you were. The king's right hand meant heir, meant beloved, meant family. It was the seat Aldrich's late mother had once held. When Elowen married in, King Rowan himself had placed her there and said, in front of the whole court, "This is where she belongs." That single sentence had gone into every newspaper in the country. But this year, the seat at the king's right hand was not hers. This year it belonged to a name she had to read 3 times before she understood it. Lady Serene Vashicourt, Marlize's cousin. And below that name, filling the entire top of the table, the seats of honor, the seats the cameras would find first, was the whole Vashicourt family. Marlize's brothers, Marlize's uncle, Marlize's mother, the old duchess, who had once said in a magazine interview that Elowen carried herself well for a florist's daughter. And Elowen's own name. It had been moved. Down and down the long table, past the visiting ministers, past the foreign guests, past the cousins nobody could ever quite place, all the way to the far end, near the doors. The end of the table where you seat people the family is politely tolerating. The end of the table you sit at when you are being told without a single word that you no longer matter. Eloin set the paper down on the flower table very gently. Her hands did not shake. That was the strange thing. Later, when she thought back on this moment, she remembered how completely still her hands had been. Inside her chest, something had gone quiet and cold and clear, like a lake freezing over in a single night. The footman was still standing there. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "is there a reply?" "No," Eloin said, "no reply." But her mind was already moving. She understood at once what this was. This was not a mistake. Seating charts at the winter table were checked 11 times by 4 separate offices. Nobody was moved by accident. This was a message, sent in the oldest language the palace knew. Marlies had waited 20 years, and now, with her whole family arriving, with her cousin placed in the dead queen's seat, with the cameras of the entire nation about to watch, she had chosen the one night in the year when the whole world was looking to show that world exactly where the florist's daughter stood. At the far end of the table, near the door. Most people receiving a message like that would have gone straight to their husband. Eloin did not. She knew Aldrich. She loved him, but she knew him. She knew that if she showed him this paper, he would storm into his father's study, and there would be shouting, and the king would be forced to choose between his son and his wife 3 days before the most-watched dinner of the year. And whatever happened after that, the story in every newspaper would be the same: trouble in the royal family. The people who loved Eloin would suffer for it. The kingdom she had spent 20 years protecting would be dragged through the mud. And Marlies would win, because chaos was exactly what she wanted. So Eloin said nothing to Aldrich. She folded the seating chart, put it inside her coat, and went for a walk in the winter garden alone. She walked for a long time. The gardeners had covered the roses in straw against the frost, and the fountains were still, and her breath made small clouds in the gray air. And as she walked, she thought not about revenge and not about anger, but about a much harder question. She thought about all the years she had swallowed things like this. The small insults, the cold seating changes at lesser dinners. The way Marlies's people would forget to invite her to certain events and then apologize with a smile that was really a laugh. She had swallowed every one of them because she had told herself the same thing every time. Not tonight, not this fight. It isn't worth it. Think of the kingdom, think of the people, keep the peace. And where had all that peacekeeping brought her? To the end of the table, near the door. That was the moment, standing alone among the covered roses, that something inside Eloin changed. She realized, with the cold, clear calm she would feel for the next 3 days, that keeping the peace and being a doormat had somehow become the same thing, and that she had let it happen one small silence at a time. She was not angry exactly. She was awake. For the first time in 20 years she was fully, completely awake, and she was looking at her own life the way she looked at other people, really looking. And she did not like what she saw. She did not decide in that garden to walk out of the winter table. Not yet. What she decided was smaller and much more dangerous. She decided to stop pretending. Over the next 2 days the palace filled up. The Vachicourt cars began to arrive, one after another, black and gleaming, sweeping through the gates as the people in the cold street watched and murmured. The old duchess came with a fur so large it needed its own footman. Serene Vachicourt came laughing, already talking to reporters, already touching the arm of anyone important. Marlies moved through it all like a woman who had finally, after long years, been given the wedding she'd never had, glowing, gracious, endlessly kind to her own blood and endlessly, perfectly polite to everyone else. She was polite to Eloin too. That was the worst part. Twice they passed in the long gallery, and both times Marlies stopped and smiled her glass-smooth smile and said, "Eloin, how lovely! "You look tired, dear. Do rest before Thursday. It's such a long evening." And both times Eloan smiled back and said, "Thank you, Marlies, I'll be sure to," and walked on. But the staff noticed something. The maids talked about it in the kitchens that night. The princess, they said, was different this week. She was kind as ever, kinder if anything, learning the names of the new footmen, sitting for an hour with the old head cook who had a bad hip, laughing softly at something the youngest kitchen girl said. But underneath the kindness there was something they had never seen in her before. A stillness, a straightness in her back. One of the oldest maids, a woman named Bettine who had served in the palace for 40 years and had known Aldrich's mother, said it best. She said, "That girl's decided something. I don't know what, but God help whoever's on the wrong side of it." Aldrich noticed too. On the night before the dinner, he found Eloan sitting by the window in their rooms, watching the last of the Vachicourt cars come through the gate. "You're quiet," he said, sitting beside her. "You've been quiet all week." "Have I?" "Elle," he took her hand. He had called her Elle for 20 years. "I know when something's wrong, tell me." For a moment she almost did. For a moment the old habit rose up, protect him, protect the peace, don't make it his problem. But she looked at him, this good man she had married, and she found she could not lie to him any more. So she gave him a piece of the truth. "Do you remember," she said, "the night your father sat me at his right hand, 20 years ago? He stood up in front of the whole court and said, 'This is where she belongs.'" Aldrich smiled. "Of course, it's in every history book now." "Yes," Eloan said softly, "it is." And she looked back out at the gate, at the last black car, at the cold gold light spilling from the windows below where the great table was already being set for the morning. "It is." She did not tell him about the seating chart. She would not put that fight on him. But she had told him the thing that mattered, even if he did not yet understand it. She had reminded him of a promise. And she had made a private promise of her own, watching that gate. She would go to the winter table. She would wear the dress the whole country would talk about for a year. She would smile at the cameras and be gracious to every guest, because the people who loved her deserved that. She would walk into that room with her head high. But she would not sit at the end of the table near the door. Not this year, not ever again. What she would do instead, what she had quietly, carefully, over 3 cold days decided to do, was a thing no one in the history of Windhaven had ever dared. And in exactly 1 day, in front of the king, the queen, the whole Vachicourt family, and the watching eyes of an entire nation, she was going to do it. The last car passed through the gate. The last light went on. And high in the palace, at her window, the florist's daughter sat very still and very straight, and waited for the longest night of her life to begin. The morning of the winter table came gray and hard with frost. By noon, the whole town of Marin's Cross was awake and buzzing. People began gathering at the palace gates before the sun was even properly up, wrapped in scarves and blankets, thermos flasks passing hand to hand, children lifted onto shoulders. They came, as they came every year, for one reason above all others. They came to see her. "Is the princess coming out first?" a small girl asked her mother, near the front of the crowd. "She always waves," the mother said, tucking the child's hat down. "Every year she sees us. You watch, she'll find you and all these people, and she'll wave right at you." Inside the palace, the great dining hall had been transformed. 10,000 candles. A table so long it took a footman a full minute to walk from one end to the other. Gold plates that were older than the kingdom's oldest laws. And down the center, a river of white winter roses, Eloan's roses, the ones she grew herself in the East Glass House, though few people knew that. She had grown the flowers for a dinner that had placed her by the door. She thought about that as her maids dressed her that evening. She thought about it and she smiled, and the smile frightened Bettine, the old maid, more than any tears would have. The dress was deep midnight blue, the color of the sky just after the last light goes. It was simple, no jewels sewn into it, no gold thread, nothing loud. Eloan had chosen it herself and refused every grander option. Around her neck she wore only one thing, a small, plain silver locket, old and slightly worn, that no palace jeweler had ever touched. It had belonged to her mother. Inside it was a tiny pressed flower from the Sunday market where she had grown up. She had worn it on her wedding day, hidden under the great diamonds, and no one had known. Tonight she wore it on the outside, in plain sight, for anyone to see. "Ma'am," Bettine said quietly, fastening the clasp, "the locket on the outside. Are you sure?" Aloan met the old woman's eyes in the mirror. "Yes," she said. "Tonight I want to remember exactly who I am." Down in the hall, the guests were arriving. Vachicourts came in like a tide. The old duchess in her enormous fur, moving slowly, expecting the whole room to wait for her, and the whole room waiting. Serene Vachicourt, laughing her bright, brittle laugh, was shown to her seat at the king's right hand by a footman who kept his eyes carefully on the floor. Marlies moved among her family, radiant, touching a shoulder here, a cheek there. A queen at last, surrounded by her own blood in the seats of highest honor. She had waited 20 years for this exact picture. And she knew, because she had built it herself, name by name, on that seating chart, that in a few minutes the cameras of the whole nation would capture it forever. King Rowan came last, as a king should, and the hall stood. He was old now and slower than the country liked to admit, and he leaned on a cane he pretended was only for show. He took his place at the head of the table. He looked for a moment at the seat on his right, and something crossed his face. A flicker. He had not made the seating chart. He signed 100 papers a week and had signed that one without reading it, trusting the office that made it, and only now, seeing Serene Vachicourt where his son's wife had sat for 20 years, did a small cold question begin to form somewhere behind the old king's eyes. But the room was full. The cameras were live. It was too late to change anything now. He said nothing and sat. And then the great doors at the far end opened, and Princess Aloan came in. The whole hall turned. The whole nation, watching on 100,000 screens, leaned in. And for a moment, just a moment, there was complete silence, because she was so beautiful in her simple dark blue and her single silver locket that she seemed to belong to some older, truer kingdom than the gold and candlelight around her. She walked in slowly with her back straight and her chin level, and she smiled, a real smile, warm and calm. And the room let out its breath and began, softly, to applaud, the way it always did, because they could not help it, because they loved her. Marlies applauded too, gently, a small perfect smile on her face. But her eyes followed Aloan the way a cat follows a bird. She was waiting. She had set her trap, and now she wanted to watch it close. She wanted to see the exact moment the florist's daughter reached the far end of the table, understood where she had been placed, and had to sit publicly on camera in front of the entire kingdom in the seat by the door. That was the whole point, not the seating itself, the watching. The little death of it, performed in front of everyone. Aloan began to walk down the length of the table. She passed the head where the Vachicourt sat glittering. She passed Serene in the seat that had been hers for 20 years, and she paused just for a heartbeat and smiled at the young woman with what looked like perfect warmth. "Serene," she said softly, "what a lovely necklace." And she walked on, leaving Serene oddly unsettled, not quite sure why. She passed the king. She stopped and she curtsied to him, a deep, graceful, old-fashioned curtsy, the kind you almost never saw anymore. King Rowan looked down at her. And that cold, small question behind his eyes grew larger. She met his gaze and held it, just for a moment, and there was nothing angry in her face at all. There was only a kind of gentle, terrible steadiness. Then she rose and moved on, down and down the long table, toward the far end, toward the door. The footman waiting there pulled out her chair for her. The seat by the door. The seat for people who are being tolerated. The whole hall was watching now, the guests openly, the cameras hungrily, Marlies most of all, her wine glass halfway to her lips, her eyes bright with a victory 20 years in the making. Aloan stood behind the chair. She did not sit. She rested one hand lightly on its back, and she looked slowly up the enormous length of the table, past the ministers, past the foreign guests, past the glittering Vashicourts, all the way to the king at its head, and then she spoke. She did not shout. She had never in her life needed to shout. But the hall had gone so completely silent that her clear, calm voice carried all the way to the top of the table and into every microphone in the room. "Thank you," she said, "for a beautiful evening. The roses are lovely this year." A small pause. "I grew them myself." A ripple went through the room. Somewhere a fork touched a plate too loudly. 20 years ago," Aloan went on, still perfectly calm, "in this hall at this dinner, His Majesty stood where he sits now and placed me at his right hand. And he said in front of the whole court, some of you were here, you remember, he said, this is where she belongs." She looked at the empty air beside the king, at the seat now filled by a laughing cousin. "I have thought about those words every day for 20 years. They were the kindest thing anyone ever said to me. And I have tried, every single day, to be worthy of them." The silence in the hall was now so total it had a weight to it. "But belonging," Aloan said, "is not a chair. I understand that now. It took me 20 years and one seating chart to understand it, but I understand it now." She smiled, and it was gentle, and it was the most dangerous thing anyone in that room had ever seen. "You cannot be seated into belonging, and you cannot be seated out of it either. So I find that it does not matter tonight where my name has been placed on this table." She lifted her hand from the back of the chair. "Because I will not be sitting here, and I will not be sitting there." She looked briefly at the king's right hand. "I don't need the seat, Your Majesty. I never needed the seat. I only ever needed to know the difference between the people who wanted me here and the people who did not." And she turned her eyes, for the first time all evening, directly onto Queen Marlize. She did not accuse her. She did not say her name. She simply looked at her, one long, quiet, level look, down the whole length of that golden table, and every single person in that hall, and every single person watching at home, understood in that instant exactly what was happening and exactly who had done it. Marlize's perfect smile did not move, but her hand, holding the wine glass, went white at the knuckles. "I hope you all have a wonderful dinner," Aloan said warmly, to the room, to the cameras, to the kingdom. "Truly, it's a beautiful night. Please enjoy the roses." And then Princess Aloan turned and she walked to the door, and she opened it herself before any footman could reach it, and she walked out of the winter table in front of the king, the queen, the entire Vashicourt family, and the watching eyes of an entire nation. The door closed behind her with a soft, final sound. For 3 full seconds, the great hall did not breathe. Then everything happened at once. Marlize set down her wine glass a little too hard. "Well," she said brightly to the table with a small light laugh. "How dramatic! Poor thing, she has been so tired lately. Shall we begin? The soup will be cold." And she lifted her spoon and she smiled around at her family, willing the moment to pass, willing the room to move on, willing the cameras to look away. But the room did not move on, because at the head of the table, King Rowan had not touched his spoon. He was staring at the closed door through which Aloan had gone, and that cold, small question that had been growing behind his eyes all evening had become something else entirely now. It had become understanding, and understanding, in an old and proud king, was a terrible thing to watch arrive. He looked down at the seating chart card in front of his own place, the little printed name at his right hand, Lady Serene Vashicourt. And then he looked, slowly, down the endless table to the empty chair by the door, the chair meant for the woman the whole kingdom loved, the woman he himself had once called family, in front of this very court. "Who?" King Rowan said. His voice was very quiet and very old, and it cut through Marlize's bright chatter like a blade through silk. "Who made this seating chart?" The whole table went still. Marlize's smile flickered. "Rowan dear, it's nothing. The offices arrange these things. You know how it is, no one." "Who?" the king said again, and now he turned his head slowly and looked at his wife, moved Aloan to the door. And in the terrible silence that followed, with 100 cameras still live and an entire nation watching, Queen Marlize realized, 20 years too late, that she had made one mistake she had never once considered in all her careful planning. She had assumed the king wasn't watching. Outside, in the cold, quiet corridor, Princess Aloan walked alone toward the great staircase, her midnight dress whispering over the marble, her mother's locket resting against her heart. She did not know yet what was happening in the hall behind her. She did not know that her husband had risen to his feet, or that the king's voice had gone cold, or that the whole balance of the palace had begun, in that instant, to shift. She only knew that for the first time in 20 years, walking away from that table, she felt lighter than air. And she had absolutely no idea that the hardest part of her night, and the greatest surprise of her whole life, was still waiting for her at the top of those stairs. The great staircase of Windhaven rose in a slow white curve toward the upper floors, and Aloan was halfway up it, one hand light on the cold marble rail, when she saw that someone was standing at the top. She stopped. For a moment, in the dim light of the high candles, she could not tell who it was. A small figure, still, waiting. And then the figure moved forward into the light, and Aloan's breath caught in her throat, because it was the last person in the world she had expected to see. It was the old Duchess, Marlize's mother. The woman who, years ago, had told a magazine that Aloan carried herself well for a florist's daughter. The woman who had swept in tonight in a fur so large it needed its own footman, at the very top of the table, in the seats of highest honor. She stood now at the top of the staircase, alone, having somehow left the hall, and Aloan understood, looking at her, that this old woman must have risen and slipped out only moments after Aloan herself, before the door had even finished closing on the silence below. "You," the Duchess said. Aloan stood very still on the stairs. Whatever came now, she would meet it with her back straight. "Your Grace," she said quietly. The old woman came slowly to the top step and looked down at her. Her face, in the candlelight, was hard to read, lined, proud, ancient. For a long moment she said nothing at all, and then, to Aloan's complete astonishment, the Duchess's chin trembled just once and her old eyes filled. "I owe you an apology," the Duchess said. Aloan did not move. She could not have moved if the palace had caught fire. "I said a cruel thing about you years ago," the old woman went on, her voice rough. "A stupid, cruel thing to a stupid magazine, for a florist's daughter. I have regretted it every day since, and I never once had the courage to say so." She drew a slow breath. "I sat down at that table tonight in the seat of highest honor, my granddaughter in your chair, my whole family arranged along the top like a wall built to keep you out, and I told myself it was just how these things are done. I told myself it had nothing to do with me." Her mouth twisted. "And then I watched you stand behind that chair by the door and tell the truth so gently that it broke my heart, and I understood all at once exactly what my daughter had done, and exactly what I had helped her do." "Your Grace," Aloan began. "No," the old woman lifted a trembling hand. "Let me finish, child, because I am old and I do not have many chances left to be brave." She looked down at Aloan, and now the tears ran freely down the deep lines of her face. "My daughter is a hard woman." Made her hard. When she was young, the whole kingdom looked at her the way they looked at nothing so kindly as they looked at the king's first wife, and later at you, and it turned something in her to iron. I know that, I raised that, but you had every reason in the world tonight to burn this whole family to the ground. You had the king's cameras, you had the nation's love. One angry word from you and my daughter would have been finished forever." The Duchess shook her head slowly in wonder. "And you didn't say it. You didn't name her. You gave her a mercy she has never once given you. Why?" Aloan was quiet for a long moment. "Because I know what it is," she said at last, "to be the woman the room doesn't want. I have been her in my own way my whole life. I wasn't going to become the thing I hated just to win a dinner." She looked up at the old woman gently. "And because cruelty answered with cruelty never ends, someone has to be the one who stops. I decided a long time ago it would be me." The Duchess stood at the top of the stairs and wept, an old proud woman crying quietly in an empty corridor, and after a moment Aloan climbed the last few steps and did the only thing her heart knew how to do. She took the old woman's hands in her own. "It's all right," Aloan said softly. "It's all right, Your Grace." And that, though neither of them knew it yet, was the moment the war truly ended. Not in the hall below with the speech and the cameras. Here, on an empty staircase between two women with no one watching at all. Down in the great hall, no one was eating. King Rowan had not raised his spoon. He sat at the head of the table, and the whole room sat frozen around him, and he was looking at his wife with an expression the court had not seen on his face in 30 years. "I asked you a question, Marlies," the king said. His voice was very quiet. That was what frightened everyone. In all his long reign, King Rowan had never needed to shout, and he did not shout now. "Who moved Aloan to the door?" Marlies's bright smile had entirely gone. She sat very upright, her chin high, and for a moment the whole force of her sharp clever will pushed back against the room. "Rowan," she said, low and controlled, "this is not the place. There are guests. There are cameras. Whatever you imagine has happened." "I imagine nothing." The king set down his spoon with great care. "I watched a woman I called my daughter in this hall 20 years ago. I watched her walk the whole length of my table tonight to a chair by the door. A chair by the door, Marlies. And I watched your family sit where hers has always sat. And I signed the paper that did it because I trusted the office that made it, and the office that made it." His old eyes did not leave her face. "Answers to you." The silence stretched. Serene Vachicourt in the seat of honor had gone pale and small. The old duchess's chair, further up, stood empty. No one had noticed her leave. "You did this," the king said. "It was not a question any more. In my house. On the one night the whole kingdom is watching. You took the seat my son's mother held, and the seat I gave to Aloan with my own words, and you gave them to your blood, and you put the woman this country loves by the door so that everyone would see it, so that she would have to sit there small in front of everyone. That was the plan." He shook his head slowly, and something in the old man's face was grief now, more than anger. "I have been a foolish old man. I have let you build your walls one small stone at a time for 20 years, and I told myself it was nothing. It was just how these things are done. Tonight I finally saw the wall. All of it. All at once." "Rowan." "No." The king rose. He rose slowly, leaning on the cane he always pretended was for show, and tonight he did not pretend. Tonight he leaned on it hard, an old king standing up in front of his whole court, and the whole court rose with him because they could not do otherwise. "You will not do this again," King Rowan said. "Not to her, not to anyone. Do you understand me, Marlies? I married you. I chose you, and I do not unsay that. But I will not sit at the head of my own table and watch you humiliate the best woman this family has ever had, because you could not bear that the people love her, and they will never, ever love you the way you wanted." His voice dropped, almost gentle now, and somehow that was worse. "That was never Aloan's fault. It was never the first queen's fault either. You have spent your whole life at war with a thing no one ever took from you. And tonight, in front of the whole world, you finally lost it, not because she beat you, because she refused to fight you at all." Marlies sat very still. And then slowly, in front of the cameras, in front of her family, in front of the king, the hard iron thing in her face cracked. Just slightly. Just enough. Her eyes, which had been so bright with victory an hour ago, filled and did not spill. Because the king was right, and somewhere underneath 20 years of walls, she knew he was right, and the knowing arrived all at once, the way understanding had arrived for him, the way it arrives too late for everyone. She had built the perfect trap. She had won the seat. She had lost everything the seat was supposed to give her. "Where is she?" the king said quietly to the hall. "Where has Aloan gone?" And a footman by the door said, "Up, your majesty, to the staircase." The king turned, and at that same moment, at the top of the great staircase, Aldrich, who had risen from the table the instant the door closed on his wife, who had gone after her without a word to anyone, came around the curve of the corridor and stopped, because he found something he had not expected. He found his wife holding the hands of the old duchess, the two of them standing close together in the candlelight, and the duchess weeping, and Eloan's face soft with a mercy Aldrich had loved her for since the day they met. Eloan looked up and saw him. For a moment neither of them spoke. 20 years stood between them in that look, the charity race, the wedding, the whole long life they had built inside these cold gold walls. "You walked out," Aldrich said at last hoarsely, "in front of everyone, in front of the whole kingdom. El, do you have any idea what you've done?" "Yes," Eloan said quietly. "I stopped pretending." Aldrich crossed the corridor in 3 long strides and took her face in his hands, and there were tears in his eyes too. "I didn't know," he said. "The seating chart, I swear to you, I never saw it, I never." "I know," she said gently. "I never told you. I didn't want you to have to choose." "You should have made me choose." His voice broke. "You've been carrying this alone for 20 years and you never once made me carry any of it, and tonight you carried the worst of it alone too, and I sat there. I sat there and ate soup while my wife walked out the door." He pressed his forehead to hers. "Never again, El, do you hear me? Never again alone." And that was where the king found them, when he came slowly up the great staircase leaning on his cane, his son and his daughter-in-law, forehead to forehead, and the old duchess standing beside them with tears on her proud face, all 3 of them turning as they heard the slow tap of the royal cane on the marble. King Rowan stopped at the top of the stairs. He looked at Eloan for a long moment, and then, in front of his son, in front of the duchess, in front of the footmen who had followed him up, the old king of Windhaven did a thing no one had ever seen a king do. He bowed to her. Not the small nod a king gives. A real bow, slow and deep and difficult for an old man with a cane, a bow of apology and of honor, the kind of bow a king gives to almost no one in his whole life. "I placed you at my right hand 20 years ago," King Rowan said, straightening slowly, "and I said in front of the whole court that it was where you belonged. Tonight I let someone take that from you in my own house, and I did not see it until you had to teach me. Forgive an old fool, Eloan, come back down." His old eyes were wet. "Not to the seat by the door, and not, I think, to the seat on my right either, because you were right, child. It was never about the chair." He held out one trembling hand to her. "Come back down as what you have always been, whatever chair they put your name on. Come back down as the heart of this family, because that is a thing no seating chart in the world can move." Eloan looked at the old king's outstretched hand, and down below, faint through the great doors, she could hear something beginning, a sound rising up from the cold streets outside the palace, where the crowds who had waited all day had somehow already heard, the way crowds always somehow hear, and were beginning to call her name. She had walked out of the winter table thinking she had lost everything. She was about to learn she had won a thing she never even knew to want. She took the king's hand,